Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Many faithful Jewish people pray a daily prayer called the Amidah. In that prayer, they pray for several blessings, including one that asks, "May it be thy will that the temple be speedily rebuilt in our days." Now, you may not have thought much about rebuilding the Jewish temple anytime recently, but faithful Jewish people pray for this every day. And today, we're going to be working through Ezekiel chapter 40 to get a glimpse of the temple that will one day stand in the land of Israel. And so welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. My name is Russ Brewer, and it is an honor to have you joining us today as we tackle one of the more controversial subjects in the entire Bible. Today we're going to be looking at Ezekiel chapter 40, which gives us a verbal blueprint of God's design of His temple for His people. And so, hang on, we've got a lot to cover today, and you might find that it's helpful to Google a picture of Ezekiel's temple to give you a sense of what we're looking at as we work through this chapter together. As we turn to this important section of the book of Ezekiel, we need to remember what has transpired so far in this book. In the opening passages of the book of Ezekiel, we saw the Lord's indictment of His people and the Lord removing His presence from them. Then we saw God unfold His judgment upon the nations of the world. They weren't exempt from His judgment either. Then after that, we saw that God will establish a new covenant with His people that won't be like the old covenant. And then Ezekiel gave us a prophetic look at the events at the end of time when the nations of the world will battle against Israel. And now we come to a passage that describes the reinstated worship of the Lord by the people. And so, going on to chapter 40, verse 1. Chapter 40 opens with a timestamp for when this prophecy was given. And it was given, if we just kind of triangulate the dates that are given here in verse 1, it was given in 573 BC, roughly 14 years after Jerusalem's collapse. And in those 14 years, tragedy has befallen God's people as Babylon successfully laid siege to Jerusalem and God's warnings came true, and thousands of people who heard Ezekiel's earlier prophecies have now died. And even more importantly, Babylon has destroyed the temple of God. Now you'll remember that in December of 588 BC, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem. And then in 586 BC, about a year and a half into the siege, he successfully invaded Jerusalem and looted and burned just about everything. Jeremiah described this event in Jeremiah 52, saying that the temple's furniture was broken up and carried back to Babylon, along with the gold and silver vessels, the lampstands, and all that stuff. And so this was a devastating time for God's people. And yet, in His mercy, the Lord has Ezekiel once again proclaim His message to His people. And this message promised the people that one day they would have a temple again and the Lord would dwell among them. And we find in these pages here a prophetic unfolding of the coming temple and ultimately the Messianic kingdom. So let's go on now to verses 2 and 3. In verse 2, Ezekiel lets us know that this is yet another vision. And once again, the Lord has transported Ezekiel back to Israel. And so Ezekiel's been placed now on a very high mountain where he could see something like a city to the south. Now, by all appearances, the city to the south is Jerusalem, and Ezekiel's on a high mountain nearby. Going on to verse 3. In verse 3, Ezekiel meets a guy whose face shone like bronze. Now, this isn't actually saying he's a bronze guy, like made of bronze. It's just saying that his face shone like bronze. And we don't know who this is, except to say he's probably not the Lord Jesus, because in Ezekiel 43, the Lord does speak to Ezekiel, and it wasn't the bronze guy who was speaking at that time. And so this bronze guy here, he's probably an angelic messenger of some sort. We've seen guys like this before. And so verse 3 goes on to say that this bronze guy was holding a line of flax, or some translations say linen, and a measuring rod, holding both of those. Now the line of flax would have been like an ancient tape measure, perhaps with knots every cubit or so that they could measure quickly distances, sizes, things like that. The rod was similar. It was like a yardstick that could be laid down end to end to measure something's size. And both of these tools are going to be used throughout the next section of Scripture to give us the dimensions of this future temple. Now, when it comes to measurements, if you look online for the dimensions of Ezekiel's temple, you'll find different people giving different measurements. And that's because Ezekiel gives everything in cubits, and a cubit was an ancient form of measurement. Now, we normally say that a cubit was 18 inches long, but there was also a Babylonian cubit, which was 21 inches long, and that seems to be the measurement that Ezekiel is using here, and that's how most Bible translations render these measurements in English. And that will be the measurement that we'll be using throughout our study of these chapters. Okay, now since we've taken this moment to pause here, let me just kind of keep this pause going for another moment longer, and let's just give a quick overview of the ancient Jewish temple. We can't overestimate or overstate how important the temple was to ancient Israel and how important it is to the unfolding of God's plan for his people. If you were to start digging into the topic of Ezekiel's temple, for instance, you would find out that it is called the third temple, and there's a ton of material on that. Now, it might surprise you that Ezekiel's temple is called the third temple because you'll also find scholars talk about Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's temple, Herod's temple, and Ezekiel's temple, and so it would seem that Ezekiel's temple is actually the fourth, but it's not. And so here's how the numbering goes. Solomon built his temple in 959 BC. That was the first temple. Of course, that was also the temple that was destroyed by Babylon in 586 BC. And so that temple is gone. And then, after the exiles returned, Cyrus appointed a man named Sheshbazzar to come and rebuild the temple, and that was all paid for by Persia. It was very nice of Cyrus to do that. But Sheshbazzar ran into a lot of opposition from the locals, and the rebuilding effort got bogged down. And so it wasn't until 16 years later that another wave of exiles returned to finish the rebuilding of the temple under the leadership of a guy named Zerubbabel, and the second temple was completed in 515 BC. Now that was all well and good, but in Ezra 3:12, which records this event, it says that many people wept at the completion of the temple. Now why did they weep? Well, presumably because the second temple was not as magnificent as Solomon's temple. Or it could have been that the second temple was nothing like Ezekiel's temple, which was what they were hoping for. But there's still one more temple to go in this whole overview of temples here, and that's Herod's temple. So let's now fast forward 500 years to 20 BC. That was the year that King Herod began a massive rebuilding project of the temple. And although we might think that Herod built a third temple, and we sometimes call it just Herod's temple, according to historians, it was really just a huge renovation project. And so that work lasted until 62 AD, and the product was much larger and grander than the previous two temples, but it still wasn't Ezekiel's temple, and it was also itself destroyed only a few years later in 70 AD by the Romans. Now, I'm sure that you all know that the temple is more than just a building and more than just a storage place for the implements of worshiping God. It was the place where God and man were reconciled. It was supposed to be the place where the Almighty Creator of heavens and earth would abide with his people. The temple itself was a standing object lesson. The form and shape and walls and courts all showed how man was naturally separated from God. The altar showed how man could be reconciled to God and brought into fellowship with him. The bronze laver, that kind of place where you would get washed, would just show the cleansing we would need from the Lord. The altar of incense showed man's prayers rising up to God. The bread showed man's reliance upon God. The light showed man's darkness and need of revelation. In terms of the physical structure, the temple was rectangular in shape, and it sat inside of a walled campus. It had a porch with two massive pillars that led to two rooms separated by a thick veil. Those two rooms were called the Holy Place and the Holy of Holies. Only the priests could go into the Holy Place, and only the high priests could go into the Holiest of Holies, and that was only on one day a year, the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And that now brings us to an important point. We saw in Ezekiel 10 and 11 that the glory of the Lord had left the people, and when the second temple was built after the exiles returned, the Holy of Holies was still empty. No glory of the Lord was there. No Ark of the Covenant was there. Maybe that's why the people were weeping as well. But again, that's all the first and second temple. As we work through the next several chapters, Ezekiel is going to give us the designs for the third temple that is very different from the first and second temples. Ezekiel laid a temple complex that is 500 by 500 cubits, or 875 feet by 875 feet. This temple complex will be several times larger than Herod's temple complex and about 12 times larger than Solomon's. Now, the temple complex that Ezekiel is going to give to us, it's also pretty symmetrical. As in, you could fold, if you could fold the temple complex in half, and most things on each half would line up with each other on the other side of that half. There are some exceptions, but by and large, this complex has a lot of symmetry going on. And as we work through these next several chapters, we're going to be learning about this third temple and what it's going to look like, its shape, size, things like that. And ever since these prophecies were given, there has been an expectation that God's people will one day build this temple. And even today, there are thousands of Jews praying every day that this temple would be built in their lifetimes. And so now with that side trip finished, now let's get back to our bronze-colored tour guide. In verse 4, the bronze-colored tour guide shows Ezekiel all kinds of measurements, and he tells Ezekiel to focus his eyes and ears on everything he's about to see to be sure he will faithfully tell these things to the house of Israel. And so he starts with the outer wall in verse 5, and all of Israel's ancient temples had these surrounding outer walls. These walls served as a point of division between the world and the Lord. An entrance within those walls was only for those who wanted to be reconciled with God. And so we see these outer walls for a verse here, and then after briefly telling us about them, Ezekiel then focuses on the gates. He's going to spend a lot of time talking about these gates. Now, these gates are not like the kind of gates you'd have in a farm or a fence or something like that. These gates here were actual buildings that would rise up many stories high to see far distances, and the gate doors would actually be within these buildings at the base. Likewise, within these gates would be all kinds of rooms to house soldiers, supplies, stuff like that. And they're big. In terms of size, these gates are 105 feet high by 43 feet wide, roughly 43 feet wide, with an entryway of 17.5 feet wide as well. And so they're pretty big. Not only that, but there are actually 6 gates in this layout, and it's not real clear in this text here until you just kind of start looking at all of this stuff individually. And so you've got 6 gates here. There are 3 that lead into the temple complex from the exterior, just the world, and then once you're inside the temple complex, there's another 3 gates that lead to the inner court area. And so Ezekiel discusses the outer gates from verses 6 to 27, and he does kind of bounce around a little bit in there, but then he also focuses mostly on the inner gates in verses 28 to 37. And this can be kind of tricky if you're not looking for it. And so try to picture this. The entire temple complex is a walled complex. It's a square with 3 giant gates giving access to the interior area. But within this interior area, there is still a second walled complex that also has 3 gates to give access to its interior. Now, you might think that the gates for this smaller interior area would be small gates too. They're not. These gates on the inside are the same size and design as the exterior gates. The thing is, they're in reverse orientation, and trying to explain what that means, one thing I thought of was like if you were to take 2 shoes, a left and a right of the same shoe, and put their heels together and face their toes away, they'd be laying there with basically the same dimensions, but being in mirror of one another. That's basically what's going on with these gates here in this temple. You got these 6 gates. You got an outer gate east, an outer gate north, an outer gate south. Then you have an inner gate that are mirrors of those same gates, an inner gate east, an inner gate north, and an inner gate south. Now, as far as these gates go, Ezekiel talks about the eastern gate first in verses 6 to 14. And the eastern gate is listed first because it is the most important gate. And it's most important because Ezekiel 44 tells us that this is the gate that's normally locked and kept shut, but it'll be the gate that the prince will come in and use. And during the days of Jesus, in Herod's temple, this was the gate that Jesus rode the donkey through on Palm Sunday, and so you can see why the people were so excited to have him just arriving on the scene back then. Okay, going back to Ezekiel here, Ezekiel talks about these outer gates from verses 6 to 27, and he explains them. We've kind of covered that. Then he starts talking about the inner court gates in verse 28, and I'd like to draw your attention to what he says about the north gate. The north gate's mentioned in verses 35 to 43, and in this section here, we find out that this is where the sacrifices will be prepared. Now, that may cause you to wonder, why are there sacrifices here? I mean, we live in a modern age, and besides that, hasn't Jesus done away with sacrifices? Well, here are some possible reasons for them. First, there are people, even today, trying to build this temple right now. And so every few months, they'll do something that makes the news. They're pretty serious about this. And so I personally think that someday some version of Ezekiel's temple will be built. And since the Jewish folks don't recognize Jesus as their Messiah, they're going to start, at least some of them will start the sacrifices back on up. In fact, right now, the most well-known plans for this temple, the designs for this temple, are being produced by an organization called the Temple Institute. You can see their stuff online. The Temple Institute has plans to recreate all of the tabernacle furniture that's described in the Book of Exodus. Things like the bronze laver, the golden lampstand, those kinds of things. And they want to make those things and then put them into Ezekiel's temple, even though Ezekiel doesn't mention them. Now, Ezekiel doesn't mention them because those things have all been fulfilled in Jesus. But obviously Jewish folks don't recognize this, and so even though Ezekiel has them missing, they'll put them back. And so I think, again, that at some point, someone's going to succeed in building a hybrid temple that's a lot like what Ezekiel is giving us here, but missing how it's pointing to Christ. And then, at some point down the road, the Antichrist will come along and say, let's not do these sacrifices anymore. And the sacrifices will come to a stop. And then, when the Lord returns, he will come through his east gate, and he'll set things up so that his people can continue to worship him, giving sacrifices of like burnt offerings, peace offerings, thank offerings, things like that we see throughout these chapters here. And so, although I realize there's a lot more to this question, we'll leave things there and come back to it tomorrow. Let's keep going on in chapter 40. And all these gates led now to an open area. These open areas are called courts. And so there's an outer court and an inner court. Now there's a lot of detail here, but basically you just need to know that these courts were paved and gave access to the interior chambers of the temple complex. Now let's talk about these chambers for a moment. These various chambers are described in verses 17, 44, and 46. And these various chambers had various uses, like for the singers in verse 44, or for the priests who take care of the temple in verse 45, or in verse 46, the priests who take care of the altar. And so when we put all this together, we have a temple complex here that it is surrounded by an outer wall. And that outer wall led to 3 gates. And those gates were these large buildings that gave access then to the open areas of the temple complex. And if you walk through those open areas of the temple complex, you can go to various chambers that were for the people who were leading the temple worship. And so that's my attempt at trying to explain Ezekiel 40 in a short podcast that's apparently not so short. But before we go, we've got to circle back and make a few key points here. For one thing, lots of people say that all of this stuff is symbolic, that we should look for symbols and allegories and all this stuff. But the details of these chapters don't lend themselves to symbolism and allegory. For instance, this chapter is talking about windows in verse 16, 25, 29, 33, 36. These windows are stated in clear utilitarian terms. Or in verse 12, there's this thin, low wall that's around the guard rooms, like you might see in an atrium of a nice hotel. Likewise, there's just these details in here that just strain effort to be symbolic. Like in verse 38, where there's a place to rinse off the burnt offerings. Or in verse 43, there are double hooks used in the sacrifices. Rather than trying to figure out what symbolism these items represent, it's much more natural to take them as actual windows and actual places to rinse off actual burnt offerings and actual hooks upon which to hang actual sacrifices. Not only that, if we take all this as symbolic, we end up symbolizing things that were common in their day and probably not meant to be symbolized. It would be like describing a hotel and saying it's all symbolic. And you can just imagine someone trying to describe a hotel in symbolic terms. And they would say, the receptionists, when you check on in, they're really like angels who bring us to heaven. And then all the pathways, the hallways that lead from that main desk, they're all the different directions we can take in life. And each room has a number, and that represents how all of our days are numbered. I mean, you can do that, but it sounds silly to people who actually stay at hotels. They'd be like, no, not really. The receptionist gives you a key to your room. You walk down the hall, you find your room, and you go in. There's not a lot to it. And that's really how Ezekiel reads. Not like some text to be allegorized, but a text to be read and understood and be taken literally. In fact, in Ezekiel 43 verse 10, this is a key verse we need to know. In Ezekiel 43:10, the Lord tells Ezekiel to bring these plans back to his people in order for them, it says, to do them. Clearly, the Lord did not intend for this to be understood symbolically, and neither should we. These are real plans for a real temple that will one day really be built. Now, we're almost done, but there's one more point we need to make here. We need to see here the Jewish focus of this temple. For instance, you can look back at verse 4. Ezekiel is giving this message to Israel. Or when we look at this temple here, we see that it is replete with things like palm tree ornaments. You see that in verses 22, 26, 31, 34, 37. Those palm trees weren't just for pretty decorations. The palm tree was one of the national symbols of ancient Israel. It was like a national flag. That's why when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the donkey, the people were waving palm branches in front of him. They were showing their national allegiance and wanted Jesus to be their messianic king. And so all of these references to palm trees and all that stuff, it's essentially saying that the Jewish national flag is going to be draped all around the temple. And the focus here, all this focus on Judaism, lets us know that God still has a plan for his people. There will be a day when the Jewish people have their own temple and the rest of the nations will stream to it, saying, like it says in Isaiah, "Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob." And so we're going to wrap things on up there for our study today. But as we think about Ezekiel chapter 40, let's keep in mind that the Lord is describing a real place that will one day stand in Israel, and may we be praying that the Lord would build His temple in our day. We'll talk more about what this temple will look like tomorrow, and until then, thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your day. God bless.